You're listening to Jay's Analysis. This is the introduction to the Jay's Analysis podcast. The only authoritative source for Jay's Analysis is Jay's Analysis. Film, philosophy, geopolitics, the esoteric, and much, much more. Satire and comedy too. Now added bonus for free. Welcome, you're listening to Jay's Analysis. I want to apologize ahead of time for some of the background noise, but I am on the road. And so this week's installment of Jay's Analysis has to come to you on the highway, the Lost Highway. I want to talk about a really fascinating book that I read. Today's review and analysis will be the Osiris disorder. Osiris Complex, which is Colin Ross's book about dissociative identity disorder / MPD, multiple personality disorder as it used to be called. And the book is really fascinating. It's basically 30 or 40 test cases, subject cases that he dealt with and engaged in therapy with, and they're all pretty unique, but there's a lot of really interesting patterns that emerge, as we'll see as we look through the book. But I wanted to also mention an article that I wrote a few years ago called The Fragmentation of the Psyche and the Nous, and what I want to do is just give my analysis, my opinion on these topics. I'm obviously not any kind of trained therapist or anyone who has any medical training or anything like that. So this is just my opinion and my analysis of these books. And Colin Ross has other books too that I've also got. I haven't read them yet. I'm about a third of the way into the next book, which he's got a book on the CIA doctors. That is the MK Ultra doctors, essentially. And then there's also another book about satanic ritual abuse, which I've read about a third of, so I might do that one in the future. Might even message him for an interview or something like that down the road. But I want to tie this into some articles that I've written and some of the philosophy and theology that we have in our worldview as Orthodox. And there are some interesting parallels, some interesting crossovers between what a lot of recent research in terms of MPD, DID has come to, and some of the older ideas of Orthodox theology and psychotherapy and so forth. But it's a fascinating topic. It's very, very hotly debated, controversial. And I think the main reason for that is because the causes are fairly difficult to deal with, where you're talking about, in most cases, pretty severe trauma that people endure that led the brain to these fractured states. But I think another reason that it's controversial, and probably the main reason, is because of the predominance of scientism and naturalistic materialism. So the biological reductionism, the idea that the brain and the mind are basically the same thing. Those are just words for the same referent. And there's no such thing really as a psyche or a soul. And I think that's the most difficult hurdle to get past for most people in this kind of a framework, because it's really the older worldviews that posited that a man has a soul, and as we've talked about many times, post-Enlightenment and post-scientific revolution and Darwinism, you get the predominance of the empirico-critical, materialist, predominant worldview. That paradigm comes to basically dominate all the so-called sciences. And there's really, if you have that presupposition, then there's really only a limited number of solutions that you're even going to consider. So if there's a diagnosis, or if there's some problem that actually is based on the reality of the soul or the psyche existing, and the solution to that problem may be involving something spiritual, that will not be considered, precisely because it's outside of the paradigm of materialism. So it's really a kind of a trap that men fall into. And I recently wrote that article about War for the Planet of the Apes, and we talked about the materialist worldview even back in the time of the writer of the Book of Wisdom, right, the early 1st century BC. And in Wisdom, chapters 1 and 2, you have a very interesting description of the life and worldview of the naturalistic materialist. And it's one in which literally the text says, man's life is but a breath. What's the point, right? Let's just basically dominate, do as best we can to subjugate our enemies, every man for himself, social Darwinism type view, right? And that's really what you're led to if there's nothing beyond the here and the now. And it's interesting to me that all the way back in the 1st century BC, the writer of Wisdom was even apparent. He was even aware of that contrast between paradigms, between these worldviews back then. And so what I find interesting about these kinds of cases in these books is that they provide another window into ways that we can try to understand theological truths in a time in history, in a world where metaphysics and theological truths and these aspects of the soul and so forth, spiritual realities, have been jettisoned, right? At least in the modern industrial, post-industrial, postmodern West, right? But you'll notice there are all kinds of replacement spiritualities or replacement woo-woo things that are not questioned, right? Those are all acceptable. It's really only the healthy spiritual tradition or traditions, the Bible, so forth. Those are the ones that we really have to persecute and to put to shame, right? You can go find some UFO cult or anything like that. That's all well and good. But anything to do with biblical patriarchy, masculinity, spirituality, the traditions of first 1,000 years of orthodoxy, that is not welcome. And what's interesting about orthodox psychotherapy and psychology, this is kind of connected to a talk I did several months ago about the logos and the logoi, and the teaching of both St. John of Damascus and St. Maximus the Confessor. And it's related to that because what we saw with St. John of Damascus in his famous book, The Orthodox Faith, or Defense of the Orthodox Faith, is that you really get a revealed anthropology, and you don't really find that anywhere else. There might be some, ancient Hindu traditions that have some vague similarity to some of the ideas, or there might be something in Greek philosophy that's vaguely similar, but it's not the same, because ultimately, as we've seen in the many Plato talks, the many metaphysics talks, there's not really a sensible anthropology in those views. You either get a kind of materialism, an end result empiricism with the philosophy of Aristotle. In terms of anthropology, man would basically just be another animal, but a quote rational animal, although we have no reason to believe that he is rational. Why is he a rational animal? Given the rest of Aristotle's metaphysic and the very bizarre theology of the unmoved mover, this unknowable God, right? I mean, that's ultimately ends up in a dead end, just as much as does Platonism. And Platonism, although it may talk about the nous, Platonism does not mean the same thing by the nous that the church fathers meant. This is a very radically different perspective. And what we mean, of course, is when Paul in the New Testament writes about body, soul, and spirit. And so there's a tripartite view that we take that is normative. And rather than it being the body-soul dichotomy that was the norm of the West, we also believe in the nous, which is the faculty that God has given man for knowing and communing and seeing him directly. And that nous, that eye for knowing and seeing and relating to God directly has to be purified, because throughout our life, our sins and so forth, or forgetting God and turning away from God, is what clouds our spiritual perception. And so that is a faculty that God has created in all men. And so it's not just mind or intellect and body that constitutes what it is to be a human or to be a man. And in that regard, as we said, the Orthodox anthropology is unique and is therefore a revealed anthropology. And again, where do we get all this? Well, we get it obviously based on the biblical text, but it's also in terms of Christology. So the seven ecumenical councils that really hammered out Christology over the first 700, 800 years of the church. Those councils debated Christology and then Trinitarian theology, the triad, and as a result they painted a picture more or less from Christology, from the revealed aspects of Christ's human nature and divine nature and who he is as a divine person, and then man being made in his image, and therefore that's how one can diagnose man's problems, right? Man's spiritual illness. You'll note, for example, I was recently sent by an Orthodox priest a very nice set by Larcher, Dr. Larcher, which is the treatment of spiritual illnesses, which is the same principle, right? Kind of Orthodox psychotherapy. And there are many books on this, so if anybody wants to delve deeper into that, they can do that. But the idea here is healing of the soul, essentially, healing of the psyche, and as we're going to see, a big part of that is going to be the integration of the person. So we many times, we might feel divided, we might feel like there's a war going on inside of ourselves, especially if we deal with some sort of vice, or we are enthralled in some moral battle or something like this. For most people, or anybody who seeks to find a spiritual path, you'll be aware of that kind of a struggle. And I think in more extreme cases, people who might have undergone different traumas, abuses, and so forth, this can result in full-on dissociation, something like when people black out on alcohol, or they take a drug or something like that, and then they're not at home, somebody else is there, they go wild. And then kind of on a spectrum, in a way, Even more extreme cases, the persons who were maybe repeatedly abused as a child can develop the full-on DID MPD with alters and so forth. And then maybe in a way even more extreme and more a more degenerative mental state is something like schizophrenia. And then depending on your worldview, I would say also full-on spiritual possession. So you have this kind of stages or spectrum or whatever, however you want to characterize it, that makes up the range of experience. But it also, that's kind of the dark side of it. It also moves in the other way, right? It also moves towards greater and greater understanding of the world, of reality, of spiritual realities, and of communion with God, and ultimately seeing the divine light, which is, of course, the perennial Orthodox view, especially in the theology of St. Gregory Palamas. So you have this very precise anthropology, but I don't want to over-intellectualize it. It's not like this is some sort of a science experiment dissection where we're going to cut apart somebody's spiritual innards, and it's like you can stack all these parts on top of each other. It's not like that, but it is, these are words or terms that we would say are descriptive of real spiritual realities in the person. So there, as we said, and many Orthodox theologians and many philosophers have noticed as well the tendency in the history of Western theology after Augustine and the split of the East and the West, the tendency to basically only have the dichotomy view in the West, right? And so for the Augustinian perspective, and then later in the Thomistic perspective, there's absolutely no place for the Nous, precisely because the human in this life cannot see God, right? This would deny the beatific vision of Roman Catholic theology. So there's not any way that there could be a Nous or any direct perception of God, given the theology and theological presuppositions of the rest of the Augustinian corpus and the Thomistic corpus. And of course, this becomes the norm for those who might be Catholic and are going to argue with me and say that, well, that's just the opinion of Aquinas and Augustine. Well, no, actually, it's also in many statements in Denzinger where it's defined what the Roman theological position is supposed to be concerning the body and the soul. And I'm not aware of any examples of anyone in the West teaching the Nous. This is completely lost. And again, that's because of the prevalence and predominance of the Augustinian perspective. Now, and again, by the way, the fact that there's a beatific vision shows that you can't have the Nous. Those two things are incompatible. And if you understand these two different theological positions, you would understand that. But you have in the East this long tradition of a much more fleshed out application of spiritual healing disciplines and so forth, and ascetic practice and so forth, that is intended to help the person gain control of the passions that are out of whack. And this is why we believe that the fall essentially threw man's passions out of whack, right? And that's in a way kind of the meaning of spiritual death. It's being under the dominion, under the control of the vices and spiritual sickness. So as a result, then, the idea is that the church is the hospital for the soul, as many of the church fathers have said. And And it's from that perspective then that I come and want to be very critical then of what I think is ultimately kind of a corporate scam. I'm not saying that it's always wrong to utilize medicines or anything like that. Obviously, medicines were given for that purpose, as the Book of Sirach says. But the idea that if man is purely a biological creature, and that's it, reductionistic materialism, then it's naturally going to follow that the establishment's only going to be willing to offer further chemicals, right? If you're just a collection of chemicals, then the only solution to your problems is just throwing chemicals at it, right? And this is really the folly of the over-medicated perspective. There's a lot of other attendant scandals and problems that go along with that, such as the fact that I think many people over the years have been experimented upon, have been test cases for all of these different drugs. I mean, you turn on the television. I don't watch TV, but I was staying in a hotel recently, and I turned on the TV, and it was all pharmaceutical ads. And it's just like, this is something, it's a total dystopia. And why is that the case? Well, for many reasons, as we said, we go back into MK Ultra and the Sandoz Pharmaceutical Corporation and the rise of LSD and all that, in concord with the CIA, which we've talked about many times. And it's kind of part of the Brave New World model of everybody being drugged and medicated. And over the last several decades, a lot of people have been test subjects and or been misdiagnosed and mistreated and so forth, precisely because of the faulty presuppositions. So, I mean, your answers to man's problems are only going to be as good as your philosophy of man. Your solutions are only going to be as good as your anthropology. So if the anthropology is all messed up, as I've said many times, you're not going to be able to do a whole lot of healing. Now, that's not to say that people in the ER or serious kind of emergency room type stuff, that you should avoid the hospital per se. I mean, that's there as well when needed, obviously. But I'm talking more about the holistic healing of the person, because it's even becoming a little more mainstream and acceptable to consider the possibility that illness can also be connected to or associated with lifestyles. And unhealthy lifestyle doesn't have to just be, junk food. It can also be spiritual choices. So I've known, for example, many women who are ardent feminists and are very open about abortion and so forth and so on, and they very young have developed cancer. And some people have connected the fact of having several abortions and so forth with cancer. So there could be a connection there, and thus the moral actions then, as we're saying, could potentially have a spiritual effect, right? In other words, your physical health can be impacted by spiritual things as well. Now, to the ancient medieval world, that was kind of like common sense. Then when man decided that there was no such thing as God or the soul, that was all tossed out, and then pharmaceuticals and plastics and technology, right, can make us into a new man, supposedly. But I think we are finding out, hopefully, that is an empty promise. There's no salvation through floppy disk. No salvation through floppy disk, right? Transhumanist Commodore 64s are not going to save us. So that, I think, is a big point to understand that a lot of people miss. And one of the great things about Colin Ross's book, and presumably the other books, is that he approaches it from a secular perspective, but he's at least open to possibilities, which I think is a positive, a step ahead. He's not discounting anything out of hand, but he's going to approach it, as reasonably and as logically as possible. And so I think the lack of flights of fancy and speculation makes his work also respectable. So he comes at it from a scholarly academic view, and that's why he's, I guess, one of the leading figures when it comes to DID research and therapy. And so we're going to look at a lot of these cases, and what I want to again emphasize, just from my perspective, is that in these cases you're going to see pretty consistent patterns, and what I think those patterns show is going to line up with some of the ideas that we're going to see in the orthodox psychotherapy principle in the article that I wrote, Fragmentation of the Psyche and the Nous, and then this concurrent idea of integration and becoming whole, essentially, not being fragmented. Because the reason this is important, and somebody might say, well, why do you even, if this is like a very small percentile of the population, why is this, it's a weird thing. If it's even real, why is this even interesting to you? Well, there is a connection between all of this stuff and MK Ultra, and many of these doctors who were MK Ultra doctors, they were all studying and specializing in this, in DID, hypnosis, etc., etc. So they were plumbing the depths of the psyche, and I'm speaking of, again, Dr. Orn, Estabrooks, Jolyon West, Ewan Cameron, Delgado, all these characters who are the preeminent MK Ultra figures, and many others. They were studying not just hypnosis and drugs, but also MPD, DID, and this kind of stuff. And they wanted to, again, plumb the depths of the psyche to know these secrets, right? And we know that from the government's perspective, from the establishment perspective, this would be ultimately for the purpose of social engineering. That's really the big plan of MK Ultra. It wasn't, the Scarlett Johansson mind control assassin. It was the creation of means and methods of influencing masses of population. And they did that. They came to those conclusions through the case studies and the test studies and the individual cases. And so then from those results, you could project or apply the same principles on a mass scale. And I think that's the real secret of MK Ultra. And this, of course, then ties into all the pop culture stuff and the music and Hollywood and all that. So, and advertising. So let's keep that in mind, that it's not just some bizarre fixation or a flight of fancy or some weird topic. It's also very relevant to, and here's the key point, how the establishment tries to create doublethink and double bind and a dissociative split state for most of the populace. And you say, well, what do you mean? How was that? Well, Orwell talks about everybody believing these completely contradictory phrases, right? War is peace, ignorance is knowledge, and all these phrases are contradictions, but they're, and he also he and I think Brzezinski, they've made the comment to the effect that people will be able to hold completely conflicting propositions in their head at the same time, and they'll be able to contradict themselves within two sentences, and and not even face them. And so those are examples. They may not be as extreme as DID or MPD, but these are kind of minuscule examples of incoherencies and of living in a split state in a way, right? Because it can't be the case that what's the most common one? Something like relativism, right? There is no good and evil, but actions X, Y, and Z that I see out there by protesters are good or evil, right? There's no such thing as good or evil, but that's good, that's evil, that's good, that's evil, right? This is probably the most prevalent one, right? There's no truth. I know the truth. I know the truth, and the truth is that there's no truth, right? That's a flat out, straight up, 100% boldface, staring you right in your eyes contradiction. And yet, I would say easily majority of the population holds that view. They believe something so preposterous. And they're, as a result, trapped in a little bitty ego box, right? They're one foot's nailed to the ground, and the other one is kind of running around in a circle. And that's because of this kind of split that we're talking about here, that Orwell talked about. Now, it's not all the establishment that has caused this. Humans have always had the same mental and spiritual problems, just as they have physical problems. So it's not like all evil is the result of some single secret society. Right? It's not like the Pentagon literally is God and runs every single thing. No. Rather, what makes our era unique, as we've said many times, is just simply that the tactics of psychological warfare and mind control and all this stuff that we're talking about here, dissociative states, it's been scientifically studied like never before. It's been weaponized like never before. So that's what makes our time period in world history unique, is the onslaught of such tactics in levels of sophistication and through means of technology that have never been seen before. And that's what's crucial to understand. So what you hear and learn and come to understand about MPD, DID people, I think, because of all the connections to MK Ultra, really give us an insight into a lot of the basic operating principles of what the deep state, the Pentagon, the big corporations through their marketing and advertising, the kind of state that they would like to create in masses of populations. And if you don't think this is done on a mass scale, I would just direct you to Brzezinski's book, Between Two Ages, where he says that in the technocratic era, this stuff will be done on a mass scale in various nations. So if that sounds too conspiratorial, well, I'm sorry. The globalists have openly said what they're going to do. So next I want to move on to Colin Ross's book, and then I'll close with some of the comments on a theological level that I made in my article.
You've been listening to my analysis of the Fragmented Psyche and the Nous, and brief review of Colin Ross's book. If you want to hear the second half, where I talk about more of the theology, in my opinion, you can subscribe at Jay's Analysis for $4.95 a month or for $60 a year. Thank you.